What would you do if the man you're about to sentence is the father who abandoned you at birth? He stood up in court, adjusted his tie, and looked straight into the eyes of the woman who had the power to destroy him and who, 30 years ago, he had left in a hospital bassinet without a name. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "Are you prepared to proceed?" That was the moment everything cracked. Naomi Ellis had built her entire identity on discipline, objectivity, and control. But nothing could have prepared her for this. The man standing before her wasn't just a high-powered attorney defending a billion-dollar pharmaceutical giant, accused of falsifying blood work on a dangerous drug. He was her biological father, and for the first time in her judicial career, the ground beneath her gavel trembled. She had spent her life climbing, surviving, thriving in a system that erased people like her, a system that told black girls from foster care they were never meant to sit in judgment. But she made it. She became the youngest federal judge in her district. She silenced the noise. Until now. Until him. Until the DNA results that showed up in an unmarked envelope. Until the journalist who whispered, "He's the reason your file went missing." Until the media leak that nearly cost her the bench. Now, the courtroom is a battlefield not just of law, but of blood, of legacy, of abandonment, of justice. He wants forgiveness. She wants the truth. And the nation wants a verdict. But before the case can be settled, secrets must burn. This is not just a story about a trial. This is about a woman who was erased at birth, and what happens when she finally gets to write her own ending. If you were denied, silenced, or abandoned, this story is for you. Stay with it. Because when justice finally speaks, she doesn't whisper. She roars. Naomi Ellis was used to pressure. At just 35, she had shattered records and ceilings alike, becoming the youngest federal judge in her district and one of the few black women to ever wear the robe in a federal courtroom. But nothing she'd faced before compared to the weight of what now sat on her docket. Crimson Pharma. The name alone sent waves through the legal, medical, and corporate worlds. On the surface, it was a pharmaceutical empire, a multi-billion-dollar company lauded for innovation. But beneath the pristine lab coats and polished press releases, something had rotted. Whistleblowers had come forward. An anonymous former employee had released internal documents, clinical logs, and lab reports. The accusation Crimson had falsified blood work data in early-stage trials of a drug called Virexon, a medication pitched as a breakthrough for autoimmune disorders. But buried in that data was evidence of hemorrhagic toxicity, blood thickening, clotting irregularities, and in rare cases, internal bleeding. And yet, the drug had been greenlit, rushed to market, pushed through insurance channels. Lives were lost. A pregnant woman in Missouri, a teenage lupus patient in New Jersey, a retired firefighter in Arizona. Families shattered. Silence bought. Lawsuits buried. Until now. And now. All of it the lies, the cover-ups. The reckoning landed in Naomi's court. The trial wasn't just high profile, it was volatile. Pharmaceutical lobbyists circled like vultures. Media vans lined the courthouse every morning. Protesters chanted outside her chambers. Her inbox overflowed with threats, praise, bribes disguised as scholarship donations. But Naomi, as always, held her composure. Justice wasn't about the noise, it was about the truth. She studied the files late into the night, redacted emails, contradictory medical reports, depositions from trembling former staff. Everything pointed toward one terrifying reality Crimson had known. They hadn't just made a mistake, they had made a decision. And now, The world waited to see if someone would finally hold them accountable. Naomi read through the final pretrial notes with care. The stakes weren't just corporate, they were human. And then came the moment that gave her pause. The defense had changed lead counsel at the last minute. The new name, highlighted in blue ink at the top of the updated filing, stopped her breath. Robert Whitmore, a man known for his ruthlessness in court, his silver tongue, his long-standing ties to corporate defense. But to Naomi, the name did more than signal a tough opponent. It triggered something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, something like memory, something like absence. She stared at the name for a long time, the air suddenly tighter in her lungs. Shaking it off, she stood, adjusted the sleeves of her robe, and whispered to herself the words she'd trained into habit: be the bench, not the wound, because in this courtroom, there was no space for fragility, not when the world already expected her to falter, not when they whispered that she was too young, too black, too emotional, too unqualified. Naomi had worked too hard, given too much, clawed her way through too many barriers to let a name shake her now. And yet, somewhere beneath the calm surface, a fracture formed. It was small, invisible to the world, but it was there. A question, a shadow, a warning. As she stepped into the courtroom the next morning, the public gallery packed, the press cameras buzzing, and the attorneys rising to acknowledge her entrance, Naomi met the eyes of Robert Whitmore across the room. His expression was unreadable. But for a fleeting second, something passed between them. Recognition, doubt, history. She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing this trial would test more than her legal expertise. It would test her very foundation, and she was ready. Or at least, she told herself she was. She didn't flinch when the name was announced. But inside, something shifted. Lead counsel for the defense, Robert Whitmore. The court clerk's voice rang out with the same formality as always, but to Naomi Ellis, it landed like a whisper from another life. She didn't know why it bothered her judges face new attorneys daily, and she had heard that name before, certainly, in the legal circuits and industry chatter. Robert Whitmore wasn't just any lawyer. He was a legend in corporate defense, especially among pharmaceutical giants. His style was sharp, his reputation sharper. He was known for dismantling whistleblowers, reframing negligence as oversight, turning liability into regrettable accidents. Ruthless, calculated, flawless on the record. And yet, as he stood up and nodded in her direction, Naomi's breath caught for a fraction of a second. There was something in the way he moved, something oddly familiar. Not just his presence, but the timbre of his voice, the way his jaw tightened when he focused, the subtle weariness in his eyes despite the polished poise. It was as if her body recognized him before her mind could place him. Naomi quickly redirected her focus to the legal documents in front of her. This wasn't the time for distractions, but her fingers hovered above the bench's oak surface a moment longer than usual. The moment stretched, silent and personal, completely invisible to the room full of people watching her for signs of imperfection. She reminded herself this was federal court. Precision ruled here, not emotion. Still, her mind flickered. Had they met? No. Impossible. She would remember a man like that. Wouldn't she? He looked older than her, at least by 20 years, maybe more. His salt and pepper hair was neatly cut, his posture proud, his suit tailored in the way only old money or old power could afford. But beneath the surface, there was something else. Something not in the official bio, not in the articles praising his legal genius. something personal, something unspoken. Naomi scanned the counsel list and case summary again, trying to ground herself in details, in facts. Crimson Pharma, data manipulation, blood toxicity, corporate cover-up. This wasn't about her. This was about justice. And Robert Whitmore was simply the latest defense attorney trying to outmaneuver accountability. That was all. And yet, she found herself watching him more closely than usual. How he conferred with his co-counsel. How he took meticulous notes. How he glanced up at her during arguments, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in something that felt eerily like recognition. She tried to shake it. Perhaps it was ego. Maybe he thought she'd admire him. Or worse, be intimidated. Maybe he assumed she'd soften at the sight of someone so renowned. But that wasn't her. Naomi Ellis didn't bend. She didn't blink. And still, there was something in the air between them. A current. Not flirtation. Not rivalry. Memory. No. She was imagining things. She returned to her chambers after the day's session. But the feeling lingered. She searched her mind for any professional link, any past case, any overlap. Nothing. Still, the nagging sensation wouldn't leave. That night, she pulled up his public records not because it was personal, she told herself, but because it was procedural. Due diligence. Familiarity bias is a known psychological factor. Judges are human. If there was any past connection, she needed to declare it. But there wasn't. Not officially. Not legally. Not professionally. And yet, her chest tightened every time she saw his face in those old press photos. Something about him gnawed at her, like a thread she couldn't stop pulling. It wasn't fear. It wasn't attraction. It was a question. And Naomi Ellis hated questions without answers. She closed her laptop, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling of her apartment. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Either way, tomorrow she would enter that courtroom. Robe on, gavel steady, and face the man she couldn't place, but couldn't forget. The email arrived just after midnight, long after Naomi had shut down the courtroom and retreated into the controlled stillness of her apartment. She had just made tea chamomile, her nightly ritual, and was about to unplug from the storm that was Crimson Pharma when the notification blinked at the corner of her screen. The subject line was cryptic, typed in all lowercase for your eyes only. No sender name, just an email address she didn't recognize. Normally, she wouldn't open such a message. Federal judges received enough digital noise from conspiracy theorists, lobbyists, anonymous patriots, and bitter defendants. But something about this one, the timing, the anonymity, the precision of the moment, compelled her. She clicked. The body of the message was short, but the attachment spoke volumes. Judge Ellis, your trial is not just about the truth. It is about your truth. Follow the thread. Don't let them erase you again. E.R. That was it. No greeting. No goodbye. Just those words in a PDF labeled Confidential Match Results. PDF. Naomi hesitated. She knew the risks. Tampering, phishing, illegal leaks. But something about those initials, E.R. Then it clicked. Evelyn Ross. The name came back like a gust of wind. Evelyn Ross, the Pulitzer-nominated journalist known for ripping the masks off medical corruption and judicial complicity. She had gone silent a year ago after claiming she was being followed during an expose on pharma lobbying. If this was her, she hadn't emailed lightly. Naomi's heart pounded, her pulse sharp in her ears. She double-checked her firewall, opened the file in an isolated reader, and scanned the first page. DNA comparison report. 2 samples, one listed as R. E. Whitmore, the other as Naomi E. She sat straighter. Her breath stopped halfway. The results were conclusive. 99.9997% parental probability. The document was clear, precise, and legally sound in format. It even included the lab's chain of custody. It wasn't fake. It wasn't speculative. It was devastating. Robert Whitmore wasn't just the defense counsel. He was her biological father. Naomi leaned forward, hands trembling. This wasn't just a professional conflict. It was personal, ancestral, explosive. The silence in her apartment suddenly felt hostile. The clock ticked louder. She tried to breathe evenly, but her thoughts raced in every direction. Why hadn't she known? Why now? Who had ordered the test? How had Evelyn gotten her DNA? The questions hit like hailstones. She scanned further and saw it sample 1 archived from a 1992 newborn screening at St. Miriam's Hospital. Her birthplace. Her file. Her DNA. Sample 2 submitted 2 weeks ago under an anonymous name, flagged by Evelyn in her investigative series titled Blood Ties. Naomi closed her eyes. Flashes of her childhood flooding back foster homes, caseworkers, a burning file room at a group home where her paperwork was mysteriously lost. She had stopped asking questions years ago. The system didn't like questions from girls like her. But now, the answer was in front of her. Cold and unrelenting, she had been denied not just justice, but identity. Robert Whitmore hadn't just been absent, he had allowed her to disappear. And now, after 33 years, he was standing in her courtroom, defending a corporation accused of hiding blood. The irony was grotesque. The symmetry was unbearable. Naomi stared at the report again, her stomach churning. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to call someone, but who do you call when the person you've been unconsciously searching for your entire life is sitting 10 feet away trying to win a case? Evelyn's note echoed in her mind. Don't let them erase you again. Naomi set the file down, hands shaking but eyes resolute. She wasn't that abandoned girl anymore. She was the judge now, and she was going to find the truth about Crimson, about Robert, and about why her blood had been buried for so long. The next morning, Naomi Ellis arrived at the courthouse before the sun had fully risen, her robe still slung over her arm and her mind thick with questions she couldn't shake. She hadn't slept. The DNA file Evelyn Ross had sent her still throbbed in her brain like a silent alarm, each line of genetic proof echoing with betrayal. But she couldn't act on instinct. She was a judge, not a vigilante. She needed facts, evidence, confirmation from sources that couldn't be disputed not just for her own sanity, but to protect the integrity of the court. That's why she called Vincent Kim, Assistant U.S. Attorney, 32 years old, sharp as glass, with a reputation for clean cases and clean ethics. She didn't trust many people in the legal system, especially not in high-stakes trials like this, but Vincent had proven himself more than once. He was also new enough not to be embedded in the political webs that had choked the careers of older prosecutors. Naomi asked him to come to her chambers under the pretext of discussing evidentiary concerns in the Crimson Pharma trial. When he knocked softly and stepped inside, file folder in hand and expression unreadable, she closed the door herself, something she rarely did. "This isn't going in any transcript," she said quietly, gesturing for him to sit. "This is between you and me, and if it leaks, I'll know where it came from." Vincent nodded slowly, sensing the weight of her tone. "Understood. What's going on?" Naomi hesitated for a split second, then reached into her drawer and handed him a printout of the DNA file. She had removed Evelyn's name and scrubbed the metadata. It was a risk, but a calculated one. "I need you to verify this," she said, discreetly, quietly, and fast. Vincent scanned the document in silence, his eyes narrowing slightly at the names. "This says Robert Whitmore is your alleged..." Naomi cut in quickly. "I don't make assumptions. That's why I'm coming to you. I want a full background investigation. I want his birth records, education history, adoption status if any, marriage licenses, sealed juvenile records if you can get them. I want to know if this man has ever acknowledged a daughter, and if so, when, where, and under what circumstances." Vincent looked up, startled not just by the request but by the steel in her voice. "Judge Ellis, this could be considered a personal conflict. Are you going to recuse yourself?" Naomi held his gaze for a long moment, the silence between them charged with the weight of everything she wasn't saying. "Not yet," she finally said. "If this proves true, if this man is who that report says he is, then yes. I'll take the appropriate steps. But I need proof before I take myself off the most important pharmaceutical trial of the decade. And if I step down now, without cause, the public will never see the truth. That's what people like him count on. That will back away the moment it gets personal." Vincent nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of her dilemma. "You want me to run this quietly?" "Completely under the radar," she said. "Use your own network, but keep it off the system logs. I don't want this blowing back on either of us until we're sure." "And what do you plan to do if it's true?" he asked. Naomi exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "That's the question, isn't it?" For a brief moment, the facade of control dropped from her face, and Vincent saw the woman underneath, not the youngest federal judge in the district, not the unshakable arbiter of truth, but a daughter abandoned, a woman blindsided, a child who had lived her whole life with a missing piece and now might finally know why. "Get me answers." "Vincent," she said, her voice calm again. "Whatever they are, I need to know who I'm looking at across that courtroom. And more importantly, I need to know what he's hiding." Naomi Ellis walked into the courtroom that morning with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had mastered the art of appearing unshakable. Her black robe hung from her shoulders like armor, her steps measured, heels echoing sharply against the marble as the bailiff called the room to order. From the gallery, she looked like the embodiment of authority, eyes cool, posture poised, the very image of judicial detachment. But inside, a storm was tearing through her chest. Her mind had been racing since dawn, since the moment she opened her eyes and remembered that the man sitting on the other side of the courtroom might not just be the defense counsel, but her father. The thought had haunted her dreams and shadowed her every move. And yet, here she was, taking her seat at the bench as if nothing had changed. Because for everyone else in this room, nothing had. They didn't know. They didn't see the way her fingers curled slightly tighter around the gavel. They didn't hear the accelerated beat of her heart beneath the layers of silk and tradition. Only Naomi knew that behind every legal argument presented today, every piece of evidence reviewed, every motion granted or denied, she would be silently asking herself, is this man lying only to the court, or has he lied to me my entire life? But none of that could show. The courtroom demanded impartiality, and she had built her reputation on being incorruptible. There was no space for personal disruption in the administration of justice, not even when it came crashing into your life disguised as a civil defense attorney. She adjusted the files in front of her, nodded once to the clerk, and gave the signal for opening arguments to resume. The prosecution began, methodical and fierce, laying out Crimson Pharma's pattern of deception. Naomi focused on the facts, internal emails referencing blood work irregularities, memos about expedited approval timelines, whistleblower testimonies from terrified lab assistants. She asked sharp, precise questions. She challenged inconsistencies. She maintained control. But every time she glanced up, every time her gaze involuntarily met Robert Whitmore's across the courtroom, something cracked. He didn't betray any emotion. He didn't flinch. He didn't stare too long. But he didn't avoid her either. His expressions were as practiced as hers, elegant, cold, professional. And that, somehow, made it worse. Because if he was her father, then he had spent decades perfecting the art of pretending she didn't exist. She reminded herself of the rules. Emotion does not belong on the bench. You are not the case. You are the law. But the words sounded hollow this time. Still, she clung to them. She forced her attention back to the documents, the facts, the framework of justice she had built her life around. That framework had saved her before when she was a foster kid lost in the system, when no one showed up to her school performances, when case files went missing and social workers cycled in and out of her life like revolving doors. The law had given her structure, language, power. She would not betray it now, not even for answers she had long buried beneath ambition. As the hours passed, Naomi resumed control of the room with skill honed from years of pushing through doubters and expectations. She ruled on objections with calm authority. She challenged both sides with equal rigor. She did everything she was supposed to do and more. And yet, the invisible weight on her chest refused to lift. Beneath the gavel, beneath the robe, she was unraveling thread by thread. But no one could see it, because Naomi Ellis had learned long ago survival, for women like her, depended on never letting the world witness the unraveling. And so she continued. She presided. She judged. And inside, she waited for the truth, for the proof, for the moment she would no longer have to pretend she didn't care who that man across the room really was. It began with a missing envelope, one Naomi hadn't even known to expect. Tucked in the daily stack of pre-reviewed documents was a routine submission from a third-party data lab used to verify background records of expert witnesses. Nothing unusual on the surface. But 3 days later, Evelyn Ross called Naomi from a blocked number and, in a voice low and urgent, said, "They're hiding things inside your chambers." Naomi's blood turned cold. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, glancing at the closed door of her office. "You were supposed to receive a secondary file from Summit Diagnostics," Evelyn said. It confirmed that Whitmore had submitted DNA for a private legal matter a month before the trial. It wasn't in your folder yesterday. Or today. Naomi felt the weight of the silence that followed, like the air itself was watching. "How do you know that?" "Because I leaked it to the system through an internal channel," Evelyn replied. "And someone intercepted it before it reached your desk." Naomi's heart pounded. She trusted few people, and among them, her court clerk and case assistant Marcia Lane had always been reliable, diligent, respectful, quiet. But Evelyn's words clung to her like a burr. "Check your chain of custody," Evelyn said. "Follow the paper trail. You'll see who signed off on that batch." And Naomi. The pause was surgical. Don't assume silence means neutrality. Some people are more loyal to power than to truth. Naomi hung up, bile rising in her throat. She called in her chief of staff under the guise of an administrative audit and requested the original chain log for that week's document deliveries. Within 15 minutes, it was clear a single envelope, clearly logged from Summit Diagnostics, had been signed for and marked non-relevant, redirected to case archive by Marcia Lane. It had never reached Naomi's desk. The attached report had been manually flagged with a post-it duplicate C main record. But Naomi knew there was no main record. This was the first and only supplemental file tied directly to Whitmore's personal history. That evening, after the building cleared and security made their rounds, Naomi entered the restricted file storage herself. Her clearance allowed her access to every box, every time-stamped log, every discarded footnote the court deemed unnecessary. 2 hours of searching later, tucked behind a stack of unrelated tax fraud records, she found it. The envelope, sealed, intact, and damning. The contents were simple: a lab intake form showing Robert Whitmore had voluntarily submitted his DNA a month before the trial. The reason listed was vague ancestral linkage clarification, but the signature was unmistakable. Naomi stared at the document, rage boiling beneath the surface of her calm exterior. Marcia had made a choice, a deliberate one, whether to protect Whitmore, protect the court's image, or protect herself. Naomi didn't yet know. But what she did know was this: someone inside her own team had decided that she didn't deserve to know the truth, that someone had taken it upon themselves to choose what she should or shouldn't see, what pieces of her own life she should be allowed to put together. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft of truth, of agency, of identity. Naomi called Evelyn back that night. No voicemail. Just a single line via encrypted text found it. "You were right." The response came instantly. "You're not alone, Naomi. But be careful. You've stepped into a war, not a trial." Naomi didn't sleep. Instead, she drafted a formal inquiry request to be submitted under seal. Marcia would be placed under quiet administrative review. She wouldn't tip her hand yet, not until she knew exactly how deep the interference went. But the mask was off. The idea that the courtroom was a neutral sanctuary had died the moment someone decided her bloodline was a threat to the proceedings. Naomi understood now justice was never just about rules. It was about who controlled the flow of information, who got to bury the evidence, and who had the courage to dig it back up. And Naomi Ellis was done being the last to know. It started with a single tweet, a blurry image of a lab report, cropped at the corners, half obscured by someone's thumb, with two names highlighted in yellow: Naomi E. and Robert E. Whitmore. The caption read, "Judge Ellis is biologically related to the lead defense attorney in Crimson Pharma case, conflict of interest DNA leak." Within minutes, the post had been screenshotted, retweeted, shared on Reddit, TikTok, Instagram, and dumped into private legal forums and public conspiracy threads alike. By the time Naomi stepped into her chambers that morning, her phone had already buzzed with over 24 news alerts, and her inbox was choking on subject lines like "developing story," "judicial bias allegations," "scandal in federal court." The image had gone viral, and while no official source had confirmed its authenticity, the implication alone was enough to send the internet and the courtroom into chaos. Naomi stood frozen in the center of her office as Vincent Kim burst through the door, holding his phone out like a loaded weapon. "It's everywhere," he said, not bothering to sit. "We've got a full-blown media firestorm. They're demanding a recusal." Naomi didn't respond right away. Her eyes were locked on the headline flashing across the bottom of the muted TV screen, blood ties on the bench beneath it. A still of her from the courtroom yesterday, looking calm, professional, unaware that her very lineage was being dissected by strangers. "Do we know the source of the leak?" she asked finally, voice low, tightly controlled. Vincent shook his head. "Could have been anyone. Someone in lab processing. Someone in court clerical. Or..." He trailed off. They both knew. Evelyn Ross. Naomi didn't blame her. The woman had warned her that truth in this case would come at a cost. Still, seeing it splayed out across social media like clickbait felt like a personal violation, an identity unwrapped without consent, a truth dragged into the light before she was ready to name it aloud. Naomi turned away from the screen, her face unreadable, but inside, the impact was seismic. She wasn't just fighting a pharmaceutical giant now. She wasn't just trying to understand the man across the courtroom. Now, she was on trial too in the court of public opinion, where gavel and gossip blurred, and truth could be weaponized before it was even confirmed. The order came swiftly, wrapped in bureaucratic language but sharp as a blade, effective immediately. Judge Naomi Ellis is placed on temporary administrative leave pending internal review for potential conflict of interest regarding Case No. 47 FD, the United States v. Crimson Pharmaceutical Corporation. The words stared back at her from the letter on her desk, stamped and signed by the chief judge of the district. It didn't matter that no formal wrongdoing had been proven. It didn't matter that she had handled the trial with more professionalism and poise than half the bench combined. It didn't even matter that the DNA report had been leaked without her consent. In the eyes of the judiciary, perception was reality, and the perception now was that she might have a personal tie to the man she was meant to judge impartially. Naomi didn't speak as she folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, her hands steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Her assistant stood silently in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or offer comfort. Naomi gave her a polite nod, signaling she didn't need anything. In truth, she needed everything: air, clarity, someone to explain how decades of work could be suspended with a single whisper of blood. But none of that would come today. She had been accused, not formally, but enough to cast a shadow enough to silence her gavel. That was the cruel irony. After a lifetime of being silenced by others, by foster homes that lost her records, by social systems that failed to see her, by a birth father who never came now, the system she had dedicated her life to was doing it all over again. She had followed every rule. She had recused herself from cases for far less. She had declared even the faintest hint of bias. But this was different. They didn't just suspect conflict. They suspected heritage. They feared that her blood could contaminate justice. And so, without trial, without defense, she was removed. Not disbarred, not disgraced, just silenced, pushed to the sidelines of the very courtroom she had fought to reach. And the worst part was, they called it procedure. Naomi stood alone in her office, no robe, no bench, just a woman angry, exposed, and unwilling to let her truth be written by anyone else. Sarah Bishop had always been the image of institutional composure, measured, meticulous, and unflinchingly loyal to the reputation of the court above all else. As the deputy chief judge, she didn't make decisions based on emotion or speculation. She followed policy, precedent, and optics, the three pillars she believed kept the justice system standing even during political firestorms. And now, sitting across from Naomi Ellis in a private chamber filled with an unbearable silence, she looked more conflicted than Naomi had ever seen her. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat untouched between them, the air heavy with the weight of what hadn't yet been said. "Naomi?" Sarah began, her tone not unkind but unmistakably formal. "You know how this looks." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The headlines had already done the damage. The leaked DNA, the accusations of judicial bias, the whispers about a personal connection to the lead defense attorney, none of it had been proven. But all of it was damning. And Sarah, whose job was to protect the court from even the scent of scandal, had no choice but to act. You should have disclosed any possibility of personal conflict before trial began. Sarah continued. Even a remote suspicion, especially in a case like this. Naomi looked her in the eye. I didn't know. I had no idea who he was until the documents surfaced. But now you do, Sarah replied softly. And the fact that you continued to preside while privately investigating a biological connection to lead counsel puts the integrity of this court in jeopardy. Naomi bristled. I wasn't investigating to protect myself. I was investigating because I deserved to know who abandoned me, who erased me. Her voice cracked, just slightly, but her eyes stayed sharp. And because I wasn't going to let a man like that manipulate another system to his benefit. Sarah sighed and leaned back in her chair, the exhaustion of her position etched into every line of her face. I believe you. But belief doesn't shield us from perception. And perception right now is poison. She paused. If I don't place you on leave, it opens the court to appeals, public criticism, and questions about every ruling you've made. The media isn't going away. Naomi. And neither is the scrutiny. Naomi exhaled slowly. She knew Sarah wasn't trying to punish her. She was trying to protect the court. Maybe even Naomi herself in a roundabout way. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like exile. Like the system was once again prioritizing image over truth. Silence over transparency. And she was the cost. Robert Whitmore stood behind the sleek glass podium at the hastily organized press conference. His expression tight, jaw locked, lips drawn into the precise line of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward with sharpened questions, and yet he held his ground with the icy composure that had made him one of the most feared litigators in corporate law. The rumors concerning a personal connection between myself and Judge Naomi Ellis are entirely unfounded, he said flatly, voice clear, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Any suggestion that I knowingly defended a case before my biological daughter is false, defamatory, and intended to undermine due process. He looked directly into the lens, his gaze defiant. I will not dignify unfounded leaks or internet conspiracy theories with further comment. But outside the perimeter of microphones and carefully worded denials, a very different story was unraveling, and at the center of it stood Evelyn Ross. That same afternoon, in the shadow of the courthouse steps, Evelyn stepped into the light, flanked not by publicists or lawyers but by folders, timestamps, and receipts. The journalist who had once disappeared from the public eye now held the public's undivided attention. Mr. Whitmore may not remember the truth, Evelyn began, her voice calm but charged. But the system does, and so do the records that weren't supposed to survive. In her hand, she held a copy of a sealed family court hearing from 1992, redacted in places, blurred with time, but legible where it mattered. It showed Robert Whitmore, then a 23-year-old law student, filing a petition to retain custodial rights of his newborn daughter born out of wedlock. The child's name was listed only as Infant E. But the mother, a black teenage foster youth who died shortly after childbirth, had named the baby Naomi. Mr. Whitmore attempted to fight for custody, Evelyn said to the stunned crowd, but he was pressured by a senior judicial clerk, his mentor at the time, not to proceed. The reason given, off the record, a mixed-race baby could derail your future. Gasps rippled through the gathering press. Evelyn went on, unflinching. This was a time when judicial bias wasn't just systemic, it was personal. Whitmore was told in no uncertain terms that fighting for custody would ruin his career before it began. And so, he signed away his rights, not out of indifference, but out of ambition, out of fear. She paused, letting the words sink in, and he let her vanish into the system. No name. No claim. No father. Somewhere behind the tinted windows of the courthouse, Naomi sat alone, watching the live stream in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't shout, but her hands clenched tightly around the armrests of the chair. She had spent her entire life believing she had simply been unwanted, that she was another lost child in a cold system. But now she understood something far more complicated. She hadn't just been discarded. She had been calculatedly erased. Erased by a system that saw her as an inconvenience. Erased by a man who, in a different world, might have fought for her but instead chose silence and success. And now, decades later, he stood before the world and denied her once more. But this time, she had a name. This time, she had a voice. And Evelyn had just lit the match that would force the truth into the open, whether he was ready to face it or not. Naomi sat motionless in the dim light of her private chambers, the glow of the paused live stream still flickering on her laptop screen. Her fingers hovered just above the keyboard, trembling slightly, not from shock, but from a pain that had no name. The truth had landed like a stone through glass, shattering whatever fragile understanding she thought she had of her past. For so long, she had accepted the narrative the world handed her that she had been abandoned at birth, an unfortunate product of loss, collateral damage of an overwhelmed system. She had told herself not to ask questions, had told herself she was strong because she had survived without knowing. But now, the truth burned brighter and crueler than abandonment ever had, because this wasn't just about a man walking away. It was about a machine, one of power, law, race, and legacy that had chosen to erase her. She had not simply been forgotten, she had been scrubbed, deliberately, systematically, quietly. And the man who had signed her away didn't just do it out of weakness. He had done it for ambition, for a future, for himself. Naomi wasn't grieving a father. She was grieving the idea that she had ever been protected by the very system she had pledged her life to. She pressed her palms into her eyes, willing herself not to cry, not from vanity, but from defiance, because tears felt too small for what she felt now. This was deeper, sharper, a rupture of identity. It wasn't just that she had been rejected. It was that her existence had been deemed inconvenient by men who wore the same robes she now wore, who swore the same oaths she had once believed meant something sacred. She had fought so hard to rise above the labels orphan, foster child, mistake. She had built herself brick by brick through law school, clerkships, impossible cases, and glass ceilings, believing that merit could outrun history. But here it was, chasing her down in broad daylight, unraveling her in front of a nation. Her very blood had been considered a liability. And for what? So a young white law student could keep his future intact. So the court could remain clean in the eyes of a public that had no idea how many lives it erased in the name of order. The rage was cold, not wild. It sat in her bones. It didn't scream. It simmered. Naomi stood slowly, crossing to the tall window that overlooked the street where protesters and reporters now swarmed. Somewhere down there, someone was holding a sign with her face on it. Some shouted for justice. Some shouted for her removal. They didn't know the full truth, only fragments. Only scandal. But Naomi knew. And now, she had a choice. She could retreat. Disappear into the narrative being written for her. Or she could rise and reclaim what had been stolen, not just her name or her position, but the very right to define who she was. She wasn't just the daughter he had left. She was the child the system had tried to erase. But she was still here. And this time, she would not be silent. Naomi Ellis walked back into the courtroom, not as a woman vindicated, but as a woman reborn. The storm outside had not subsided, in fact. The noise had only grown louder. Protesters still lined the courthouse steps. Commentators still debated her ethics on national television. And inside these walls, whispers still clung to her robe like dust, but none of it mattered now. She wasn't here to be liked. She wasn't here to explain herself. She was here to deliver judgment. The court rose as she entered, her presence commanding silence without demand. No one could miss the difference in her posture: calm, unflinching, purposeful. She took her seat with the quiet authority of someone who had crawled through fire and returned with her spine intact. When she called the case to order, her voice rang clear and sharp. The defense attorneys, including Robert Whitmore, sat frozen, watching her with unreadable expressions. This was the same woman, yet entirely changed. Naomi reviewed the findings slowly, surgically. She laid out the facts that Crimson Pharma had tried to obscure: the manipulated blood data, the fabricated test results, the corporate memos acknowledging risk and choosing profit. With each word, she peeled back the layers of deceit that had taken lives and mocked the idea of accountability. The courtroom was silent. Even the lawyers who had once pushed back against her rulings now avoided her gaze. There was no ambiguity left. Only truth and consequence. Crimson Pharmaceutical Corporation, she announced, knowingly distributed a drug that endangered the public, misled regulators, and covered up adverse outcomes with falsified documents. This court finds you guilty of criminal negligence, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Her gavel struck like thunder. You are hereby ordered to pay restitution to the families affected, and all profits gained from the sale of Virexon will be seized and placed into a national medical trust fund for victims of unethical pharmaceutical testing. She turned her gaze toward the gallery, and though her words remained formal, her tone carried something more. Justice is not a shield for the powerful. It is a promise to the people. And in that moment, Naomi Ellis reclaimed not just her bench, but her voice. As the courtroom began to stir with the weight of the verdict, chairs shifting, murmurs rising, Robert Whitmore slowly stood from his place at the defense table, not with the pride of a man who had just lost a case, but with the heavy gravity of someone about to unearth something far more personal than corporate shame. His co-counsel reached to stop him, but he gently waved the hand away. Naomi Ellis, still seated at the bench, met his gaze with the practiced neutrality of a judge, but something behind her eyes flickered caution, recognition, a quiet storm held beneath glass. Robert adjusted his tie, turned to face the gallery, then slowly turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, voice trembling slightly for the first time in decades of legal argument. "Before this court adjourns, I respectfully ask permission to speak on record not as counsel, but as a man." Naomi hesitated. The courtroom held its breath. Then she gave a single nod. Robert exhaled and steadied himself. "I have been many things in my life," he began. "A lawyer, a partner, a strategist, and I have been accused, rightly, of putting ambition before conscience. But today, I must confess the role I played not just in this case, but in the life of the woman presiding over it." Gasps erupted. Naomi's hands gripped the arms of her chair, her jaw tight. Still, she said nothing. Robert's voice cracked, but he continued. "Over 30 years ago, I was a scared young man, newly admitted to law school, when I learned that a woman I had cared for briefly, deeply had died giving birth to our daughter. That daughter, born into a broken system, was Naomi Ellis, my daughter, and I did not raise her. I did not protect her. I did not even claim her. The room froze. I was told by mentors, judges, and those in positions of power that acknowledging her would ruin me, that a mixed-race baby born out of wedlock would destroy any future I hoped to have. I was weak. I believed them. I signed away my rights, and I allowed the system to erase her because I was too cowardly to fight it. His voice cracked, and this time he didn't try to hide it. But she rose anyway. She became everything they feared she could be. And I don't ask for forgiveness. I only ask that the truth be known. Here, now, because she deserves that. Because she always did. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi did not speak. She could not. The truth was no longer buried. It had been spoken in the place it was meant to be under oath, in open court, where no one could erase it again. The courtroom exploded into a media frenzy the moment Robert Whitmore's confession hit the public record. Reporters who had been idly scribbling in notepads suddenly lunged for their phones, live blogging every breath, every syllable. By the time Naomi Ellis stepped out of the building, headlines were already rolling across national news banners. Judge's biological father admits past in open court. From abandonment to justice. Naomi Ellis's full circle moment. Legacy on trial. The hidden bloodline of the Crimson case. Satellite trucks lined the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed like lightning. Microphones lunged at her from every angle. Questions flew through the chaos like shards. Judge Ellis, do you forgive him? Do you believe this undermines your verdict? How does it feel to hear the truth this late? But Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't pause. Clad in her black coat, eyes steady beneath the harsh morning glare, she stopped only once, standing just above the crowd, and raised her voice not to fuel the noise, but to quiet it. I will say this once, she declared, calm and measured, the weight of generations in her tone. I don't forgive the past. I don't erase it. I don't pretend it didn't shape me. She looked out at the sea of eyes, some hungry for drama, others quietly hoping for healing. But I don't live for the past. I live for the future. There was a beat of stunned silence, as if even the air had been stilled. Then the roar came, reporters shouting, camera shutters firing, voices rising in a storm of speculation and sound. But Naomi had already turned away. She didn't need to explain herself any further. Not to the press. Not to the man who had once left her. Not even to the system that tried to bury her. Her words were not about forgiveness. They were about direction. She would not let her story end in pain, or pity, or scandal. She would build forward, with or without the world's applause, with or without her father's regret. In a world eager to define her by headlines and history, Naomi Ellis chose something far more radical to define herself. It arrived in the late afternoon, hand-delivered by a quiet courier with no return address, just her name written in a slow, careful script across the envelope, Judge Naomi Ellis. There was something jarring about seeing her name written so intimately, without title, without ceremony. No stamp, no signature block, no legal letterhead. Just paper, ink, and a silence that felt more human than anything she'd received in months. Inside, the letter was folded neatly, the handwriting uneven, marked by long pauses and occasional scratch-outs. The first line read, I don't know if you'll read this, or if I deserve for you to. Naomi sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in her hands as she continued. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in a quiet corner of St. Mary's. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm here, being monitored by machines, while trying to speak honestly for the first time in decades. I have time now, too much of it, and no more public stages to stand on. My hands shake when I write. My thoughts wander. But there's one thing that doesn't leave me, you. Naomi's eyes stung, but she didn't blink. She kept reading. I don't expect forgiveness, Naomi. I don't even ask for it. But I need you to know the truth that I didn't have the courage to say before. I was there the night you were born. They didn't expect me to show up, but I did. You were so small, so perfect, wrapped in white. Your mother never woke up. They said it was complications. I don't know if I ever believed them. I was 23, terrified, and desperate to do what was right. But when I tried to fight for custody, I was pulled into a quiet room by someone who said they were trying to protect my future. A man I admired, a judge I had interned for, told me flatly that keeping you would mean ending my career before it started, that a black child with no mother and no pedigree would stain everything I hoped to become. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just signed. I signed the papers that let them take you, and I told myself you'd be placed with someone better, someone more stable. I told myself you wouldn't remember me, and maybe that was kinder. I buried you, because I didn't know how to face what I'd done. I kept climbing, kept winning cases, kept being brilliant, and every win tasted like ash. Because behind every judgment, every defense, was the one person I failed to defend. Naomi's hands curled around the letter, but she kept reading. Breath shallow. When I saw you in that courtroom for the first time, I thought I was imagining it. Your face, your posture, your voice. It was like hearing a version of myself I'd never earned the right to know. And when the reports surfaced, when Evelyn dragged it all into the light, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not shame, not exposure, but relief. Because finally, the lie was over. You don't owe me anything. Not a visit, not a response. But if there's one thing I hope for even now, even this late, it's that you'll understand I have always regretted the silence. And I believe, however imperfectly, that time what little I have left can still hold space for truth. I don't know if there's a way forward. I only know I want there to be one. Even if it starts with a letter. Even if it ends in peace. Robert Naomi didn't cry. She simply folded the letter, placed it beside her teacup, and stared out the window as twilight crept in. In a world built on verdicts, this wasn't a judgment. It was something rarer. It was a beginning. Naomi sat alone at her kitchen table long after the letter had been folded and set aside, the silence around her thick with everything unspoken. The evening light had faded to a soft gray, casting quiet shadows across the room. The envelope still lay within reach, its paper edges slightly curled, touched by the heat of her fingertips earlier. She hadn't moved for what felt like hours, frozen not by indecision, but by the weight of clarity. Her entire life had been a battle against invisibility, against the silence she was born into, the erasure written into her file, the blank spaces where a father's name should have been. And now, sitting here with his words in her hand, she felt something shift, not forgiveness, not closure, but something heavier and more enduring. She reached out slowly, deliberately, placing her palm flat on the envelope as if grounding herself in the weight of it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she exhaled and whispered into the quiet. Not for the room, not for the letter, but for herself. I am not just a judge. she said, her voice low but steady, laced with quiet defiance. I am living proof for every child the world tried to forget, for every name crossed out, for every caseworker who didn't look twice, for every door that closed before a choice could be made. I am not just a verdict on paper. I am what happens when erasure fails. Her voice grew firmer, though still soft enough that only the walls could hear. They wanted to write me out of the record. You let them. But I wrote myself back in with every class I passed, every courtroom I walked into, every law I upheld with more integrity than they ever expected from someone like me. She pressed her hand harder against the envelope now, not out of anger, but as if claiming it. You see a judge, but I am more than that. I am a scar that didn't fade. I am the daughter they tried to lose in the system. But I made it out. And I didn't just survive, I became the very force that could hold them accountable. The room stayed still, holding her words. There was no audience, no cameras, no robe, no gavel, just Naomi. Bare and honest, finally speaking a truth she had carried in silence for years. So no, I don't forgive the past, she said again. This time not out of coldness, but out of respect for its weight. But I live for the future. And I will not let my story end in someone else's shame. Her hand slid gently off the envelope. She didn't need to reread the letter. The truth was no longer in ink. It was in her blood, in her voice, in her presence. She had become everything the world thought she couldn't. And now, as the night deepened and the city hummed outside her window, Naomi Ellis sat quietly, shoulders back, head high, ready not to forget but to lead, because her existence was no longer a question. It was the answer. In a world that so often demands perfection before it allows redemption, the story of Naomi Ellis and Robert Whitmore reminds us that truth, however painful, however late, is still worth telling. Naomi did not set out to become a symbol. She was a judge, a public servant, a woman who believed in the structure of justice because it had once been the only thing solid in her life. But the revelation of her past shattered that structure and forced her to confront a deeper, more human truth that systems, no matter how noble in theory, are made of people. And people fail. Robert Whitmore failed. Not just as a young man who walked away from his daughter, but as a product and later, enabler of a system that taught him ambition was worth more than love. But even in his failure, he reached for a final act of courage. His confession didn't rewrite the past, and it didn't earn absolution, but it gave Naomi something no courtroom ever could recognition, proof that she had not imagined the weight she carried her entire life, acknowledgement that her pain had a source, and her strength had roots. In many ways, Naomi's greatest act wasn't her verdict against Crimson Pharma or her composure during national scandal. It was the moment she chose not to let her past define her future. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't crumble under the pressure of headlines or whispers. She stood firm in who she was, not in spite of her story, but because of it. And in that, there is a lesson for all of us. You don't have to come from wholeness to create meaning. You don't need perfect beginnings to carve out a powerful middle or end. You may have been denied, erased, left behind, but your existence is already resistance. Your voice, your success, your ability to name your truth in a world that tried to bury it, that is power. Life will hand us disappointments. People will abandon us. Institutions will fail us. But how we respond, how we stand, speak, and live forward is where legacy begins. Naomi didn't forgive the past, but she chose to build a future anyway. And that choice to move forward without erasing the pain is the truest form of healing. So wherever you are in your journey, Whatever truth you've been afraid to face or story you've been told doesn't matter. Remember this: you are not invisible. You are not voiceless. And your story, like Naomi's, may be the very thing that sets someone else free. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or gave you something to hold on to, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Don't forget to save this video so you can return to it when you need strength, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Every like, share, and comment helps us bring more truth to light. Let your story speak, and let it be heard.